Mr. President, I rise today to speak to an issue that in my state of Alaska, in the state of North Dakota, quite honestly, in so many of our home states, we have facts, we have statistics, we have issues that face our indigenous peoples, most particularly our indigenous children, that, truth be told, these statistics are not what we want to write home about. In fact, in many, many cases, these statistics are shameful, and the effort and the initiative to make a difference in the lives of the children of our First Peoples is an effort that I want to speak to today and join with my colleague from North Dakota in addressing this issue. I want to help shine a light on the conditions facing Indigenous children in our country for whom the United States has a legal commitment. This is a federal trust responsibility that is owed to these children. And I would like to thank Senator Heitkamp for her commitment, for her compassion to address these issues facing our nation's Indigenous children by introducing legislation to establish the Commission on Native Children. And I will defer to my colleagues so we can have a conversation about this, but I think it's important to note that it was the very first time, Mr. President, that I'd ever met Senator Heitkamp. We literally exchanged handshakes, introduced ourselves, and within 5 minutes, we were talking about children's issues, Native children's issues in our respective states. And that little 5-minute discussion led to much further discussion later on and a commitment to work to address these. So, Mr. President, I do have many remarks that I would like to make this afternoon, but I would like my colleague from North Dakota, who has worked so diligently on this issue with her staff, working with my staff, to describe to our colleagues the legislation that today we are both introducing, establishing the Commission on Native Children.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. I just start out with a story, because I think a lot of us come to the United States Senate with a lot of experiences, a lot of common experiences, and I think the senator from Alaska and I have shared this common experience of seeing the despair, looking at the statistics, but more importantly, being in my case, in Indian country, in her case, working with Indigenous people and seeing so much more needs to be done. Seeing the disparities in education, seeing the disparities in healthcare, seeing the disparities in housing, and recognizing all of those things have huge consequences. Seeing what high poverty does to people who aren't given the right opportunities. And I think frequently, it's so important that we do something like this so that we can begin that process of educating our colleagues on how this situation is different. What are our experiences? If you haven't seen or been in Indian country, if you haven't looked at the statistics, it is alarming. It is absolutely alarming. And the one I want to give before I talk about our legislation is the statistic on mortality rates. In this country, child mortality has decreased by 9% since 2000. That's good news. We're paying more attention, doing better jobs at infancy, doing a better job raising our kids. The child mortality rate among Native children has increased 15%. Increased 15% at the same time that it has decreased in this country, 9%. And we've tried various programs, whether it's housing programs, education programs, higher education programs, but we know that this works better if we all work together and we work collaboratively. And I know a lot of people have suspicions about things called commissions. But I believe for the first time we will be pulling together the data regarding what is exactly the status of children all across, Native children, all across the United States of America and in Alaska, Indigenous people as well as Alaskan folks, and pulling those statistics together and saying, where do we begin to understand this problem differently and change outcomes? Because if we keep doing what we're doing right now, we will fail the next generation of Native children. We will fail to do what we need to do. This is not a new issue for me. When I was Attorney General, I spent a lot of time in Indian country, a lot of time on Indian issues. I want to just tell a story before I describe just briefly what this commission would do. Tell a story. It's a story about a woman who showed up at a conference. We were talking about trying to get resources to do a conference on juvenile crime on the reservations. And she told a story about how she was dyslexic as a child. And her mother was not a very patient woman, and she was waiting to go to a birthday party. And she was sitting and looking out the window. And she would ask her mother every 5 minutes, is it time yet? Are they going to come? And finally her mother, out of frustration, took this woman's hand, this little girl's hand, drug it across a nail that was on the window ledge, back and forth, and says, maybe now you'll remember. And she held up her hand, and you could still see the scars. And she said something I'll never forget. She said, who cares about me? I looked out that window and thought, who's going to come and help me? All across America, there are children looking out a window in Indian country and in all of these very remote places, wondering who's going to care about them, who's going to help them. Isn't that the job when we have trust obligations? Isn't that the job of the United States Congress? Isn't that the job of all of us to care about all of our children? But yet these children are left behind time and time and time again. You'll read a story in the paper about an abducted child, and you don't realize that there could have been 10 children abducted off a reservation in North Dakota. You don't read a story about trafficking in North Dakota, but it's happening. You don't read a story about child abuse and neglect, and it's happening. Or failed schools, schools whose roofs are caving in because we haven't met our education obligation. And so what this commission would do is to bring attention to this very important part of our population, the part that gets left behind, that no one looks out for, and start saying, what are we going to do differently? What are we going to do differently for our children? These are all of our children. And I can tell you that same passion that I felt a kindred spirit when we began to talk about this issue with the senator from Alaska and talk about how important it was for people to really understand those challenges and how important it was to prevent costs later on. If we just do a little Head Start, children in Indian country go to Head Start at a lower rate. Their education system fails them. 50% of Native kids graduate from high school compared to 75% in the white population. These statistics mean a lot, and we all look at statistics, but behind each one of them is a young child struggling to make something out of their lives in this world and wanting to believe that they matter. And so what we are doing today is introducing a commission on the status of Indian children to simply say, you matter. And we need to come up with different ideas and different solutions on how we're going to solve the problem. And I know that even though we share, I had a great opportunity to go to Alaska and spend some time with the Alaskan corporations and the indigenous people in Alaska. And it is a new experience for me because we're used to Indian country, we're used to reservations. But so many of the challenges, and I'm sure the senator from Alaska would agree, so many of the challenges are so similar in Alaska and North Dakota, partly because of our remoteness, but partly because these are obligations that have not been lived up to. And so I want to ask the great senator from Alaska how she thinks this commission could work to actually better the children, the Native children in our country.